welcome into the Roundtable. Bill Priestley alongside Zach Strickland, Tony Mulvey. We're going to talk a little bit about what's behind us here in the American Southeast and the fact that this may be one of the geographical regions, certainly since I've been in FreightWaves, that has had such an ebb and flow to it over the course of the last couple of years or so, and kind of digging into what's going on in this region in the country. Obviously, you have positives in Laredo in terms of what's been going on there, but also shifts in TEUs coming in, Port of Houston, Port of Savannah, Port of Jacksonville, Port, and all the way up down the East Coast. So, guys, as you look at this, and this kind of cues into your chart of the week this past week about Atlanta suffering from this particular area, what's been your gauge on the Southeast here?
Yeah, it's been a very market here down in the Southeast. Over the last couple of months, we've really seen a return of freight volumes going back to the West Coast. And this is due to numerous reasons, some of them geopolitical. The Suez Canal, for instance, impacted by the war in Israel and Gaza, and then, of course, the drought and the Panama Canal. The Neo-Panamax Canal, of course, is the one that is big enough to handle those big container ships. So it takes the most water. And since that's been limited, that's also just making it easier. And I don't think that these are like the driving reasons why we're seeing this. I think this is a natural, it's kind of a path of least resistance for a lot of shippers to, when they bring in freight from China, which is consumer freight centric, which is this time of year, the retail freight really comes in. It's just quicker and easier. And since costs are down and there's not a lot of service deterioration, a lot of that freight that was, and we thought some of this would have some stickiness on the East Coast because once you're doing it, you might as well keep doing it.
Right.
But I think some of these other triggers have made it easier just to be like, instead of dealing with all this other noise, I know that I can get freight into the West Coast and just pull it across the country for a fraction of the cost that it was during the pandemic. And that is really eroding the volume coming out of the Port of Savannah, which actually really has a feeder into that Atlanta market as well.
Yeah. Tony, this is what's your take on the situation? Again, noting, of course, when you had labor issues at LA Long Beach, all of a sudden people wanted to go a different way. And the pandemic happens, you get lots of backloading there, and all of a sudden, hey, this comes a great option. And then it looks like the bottom's been basically taken out from under the Southeast.
Yeah, I mean, Zach hit the nail on the head. I think the Panama Canal is probably arguably the largest reason because, I mean, you have to factor in the transit time, right? Direct route from, I think it's Shanghai to LA is 15 days. And it was 21 days to Savannah. So you're talking an extra 8-day or an extra week, basically. Now you factor in the Panama Canal because they're not going the Suez route. That you're just intensifying this time, and especially right now, right? You mentioned this consumer goods that flow in at this time of the year, like adding that extra time, you're going to miss the season. And I think that's part of the reason why you saw this almost longer peak in the ocean. I mean, if you look, it lasted almost 2 full months of volume level, and they're relatively stable, maybe not as high as what they were or like a true peak, but it was this prolonged 2-month stretch of consistent volume. And I think that's helping. That kind of shows this time sensitive nature. They didn't really have it, but like you said, this path of least resistance, infrastructure's already built on the West Coast. They're investing still here, and it's not completed, right? Maybe once it's completed, they have the ability to take more share, but until that time, why would you not use the infrastructure that's already in place, that you already know works, that's not under the stress that it was 2 years ago?
One thing we didn't talk about here that's not necessarily evident, of course, with what we talk about on a daily basis, the Mississippi River. The fact that there's not much going on. I mean, with the water levels are down there, exporting, obviously the grain has to get out through the Mississippi River. You're looking through rail there as well. But past that, Zach, what are you looking for in terms of stress points, maybe even choke points as this moves forward? Because obviously you mentioned Atlanta, they're suffering at this particular area. What other areas possibly could be at a different level of efficiency in terms of the fact that the freight's just not there, or at least it's not coming, at least?
Yeah, I mean, right now, actually, the northeastern corridor itself, too, also has a little bit of an exposure to this because that's the second largest port complex in the United States. But I think that infrastructure, or the freight that flows up there, is a little bit different than the stuff that comes into Savannah. I think you have an easier trade-off with LA and Savannah versus New York, New Jersey. But That being said, I think this pattern, though, the concern for me moving forward isn't necessarily like, where's the demand going to go? It's about what happens when the capacity side of things kind of falls down, as it's doing currently, and everybody's rushed back into their old ways and their old behavior patterns of pulling all this stuff into the West Coast through the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach. The freight that comes out of that area has to traverse what we call a freight desert.
Yes.
And carriers are actively avoiding the freight desert because they know they can't get their trucks moving. So as capacity comes down, right now there's capacity everywhere, and they're basically lining up to they'll drive wherever to get whatever. But once that capacity erodes, and a lot of carriers are actively avoiding, California CARB rules and emissions, like it's not a market they really want to get to. They just have to deal with it because it's the single largest import area of the country. Mm-hmm. So you have to have exposure there if you're an over-the-road carrier. Once capacity erodes, though, that market is going to be probably the single biggest choke point for shippers as the market turns the other direction.
Tony, what do you think?
Well, I think that's interesting what you were talking about the capacity front. I wrote about it in the Daily Watch actually today, that if you look at the ebbs and flows in Southern California in capacity, look at rejection rates in Southern California, going back to September, you can see the as trucks come in and when they leave, you see it on a seemingly weekly basis. It's just amplifying the movements, because the ones that are operating out of there or going in there, it's this game. When the truck's there, they'll accept it, and when it's not, they'll reject it. But you're not seeing just this mass entrance into California like you were when rates were $2 or $3, $4, $5 a mile.
Yeah.
It's not this influx necessarily of trucks, and it's causing this increased volatility in the market because they still have to operate in there, and they don't really have an option, right? It's like you said, It's the largest market in the country. You can't ignore it, but you have. Right now, there's still freight demand in other places, but the kicker is going to be the capacity front, and how does California and CARB really impact that?
Yeah.
Especially, the first deadlines in a few weeks.
Yeah.
It's coming real soon. So my dad has been blowing me up about that in conversation.
Gotcha. So how would you forecast this particular region of the country? I think we're kind of in agreement at least that Laredo is kind of an outlier here. It's strong. It's going to be strong, it looks like, for a long time. But other than that, looking at the rest of the region, what do you see as freight being cyclical? But is it going to come back?
I think Atlanta is impacted by this development as well. I think right now the Laredo situation is largely manufacturing. It's automotive-centric freight that's coming across the border. Mm-hmm. Once the consumer freight, like factories and things, get built out down there, depending on what supply chains do in Mexico, because that's largely what moves out of Atlanta. Atlanta is a hub for the Southeast. So that's why you have freight moving out of here. It really gets staged here, and then it gets distributed across this region primarily, or it may jump up into the Northeastern corridor at times. So I think from this perspective, it's not great looking forward in the near term for Atlanta, because we're expecting freight demand to cool off in January, February. Mm-hmm. However, I think it will be interesting to watch this market in particular in March and April, because I don't know if everyone knows this, but March tends to be the hot season for Atlanta. This is when the freight demand really picks up here more than any other area of the country. LA dies, Chicago's not quite as active, but Atlanta, the southeastern region, wakes up first.
So how would you forecast the Southeast?
You have to think investments are being made, but I would say it's going to be, I think a rail perspective is going to be this growth arm, especially, you're seeing the investments made in Savannah, and it's going to connect Savannah into Chicago, but what's that do for truckload demand? Because, ultimately that's going to be the key, is you're still going to you're going to be fighting that. Once that gets built out, you're going to be fighting that, because that's some of the freight that's moving out of your Atlantas and Savannahs is moving up into the Northeast, Midwest. It's going to be a fight for future freight demand from a truckload perspective as this infrastructure really gets built out. And I think that's going to be the key. And
Georgia, of course, reported a couple of days ago building another inland rail port there as well. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us for our roundtable today. We'll take a short break. We'll be back with more after this.